PodCastle, episode 901 for Tuesday the 22nd of July 2025. Moths in a Fluttering Heart by Christine Lucas. Read by Kat Corbetti, produced by Eric Valdes and selected by guest editor Devon Martin. Rated PG-13, with content notes for ableist slurs and attitudes, violence and misogyny. Good morning, good day, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to PodCastle, the flying castle of fantasy fiction. I'm your host, Matt Dovey, and it is my privilege to present the fourth tale in our month of disability, pride and magic, Moths in a Fluttering Heart by Christine Lucas, narrated by Kat Corbetti. This story was first published in Abyss and Apex, January 2024. This is the last of the disability stories I'm hosting, as Devon is taking over for the final story of the month next week. The brilliantly titled Godzilla as a Young Man Named Mike. Just putting that out there now to make sure you come back, because I know you won't be able to resist that title. So I want to take this chance to offer my summary thoughts on the month, so that I can leave the outro to today's story alone. Obviously I'm enormously biased on every possible axis when I call it a stunning showcase, a huge success, a vital and landmark set of stories that we should laud and thank Devon for unto the end of our days, and I will. But facetiousness aside, it really has been a hugely important month, for me even if for no one else. I'll often say that ableism is the most invisible and unquestioned form of prejudice, the one that's so baked in most people don't even know the word, let alone recognise it, let alone see it in the thoughts and opinions they've inherited from the society around them. Which is kind of maddening, given that everyone ends up disabled at some point in their life. Even if you dodge all the illnesses and accidents and genetic inheritances that lay in wait like traps throughout a life, you can't dodge time, and age will catch you eventually. I've been disabled my whole life, but, and this is the crucial part, I've only actually known that for 2 years. At the same time, my wife Claire, diagnosed with MS 4 years ago, has steadily declined on a physical level, becoming more dependent on disability aids but also accessibility support at events like Worldcon or in places like airports and museums. I have become acutely, painfully aware of the ableism in the world, the cost it extracts from its victims, and, most of all, what an afterthought disability is to a world that just chooses to ignore it as much as it can. As an inconvenience, an expense that can, regrettably but inevitably, be crossed out, as something not important enough to important enough people to actually bother dealing with. And apart from the day-to-day problems that causes, the logistical problems and access issues, etc., what that does is soak in. Internalised ableism is so insidious and pernicious. It isolates you, it leads you down paths of self-recrimination, it undermines and undercuts and steals all your optimism and confidence and hope. And the antidote to that is stories. Either fiction, as we're sharing this month, or anecdotes and feelings and opinions shared between each other that help us see we're not alone, we're not to blame, and there are better ways. It is easy to say that seeing yourself in a story is a powerful thing, and it is easy to hear it and understand the concept and smile and nod and agree. But my goodness, sometimes it is a freight train to the heart to experience it. More than once this month I've finished reading a story and been genuinely short of breath with the emotional impact it's had on me, for the moments of recognition I've had throughout and the realisation or celebration or catharsis at the end. I hope I'm not alone in that. I hope it's done the same service for some of you out there this month. Not that we're done yet. Today's story is written for you by Christine Lucas, a Greek author, a retired, disabled Air Force officer and mostly self-taught in English. Her stories are her way to explore the universe as a queer and neurodivergent person who spent too much time in a closet already. Her work appears in several print and online magazines including Future SF Digest, Pseudopod and Strange Horizons. She was a finalist for the 2017 WSFA Award and the 2021 Emeka Walter Dingus Memorial Award for Disability in Speculative Fiction. Her collection of short stories titled Fates and Furies was published in late 2019 by Candlemark and Gleam. Your narrator, Kat Corbetti, is a queer Greek/Serbian speculative fiction writer, culture critic, narrator and podcaster based in London, UK. She is a Hugo and British Fantasy Award-winning podcast editor at Strange Horizons magazine, hosts the Right Song podcast, and writes about SFF arts and theatre for the BSFA. She also organises Spectrum, London's SFFH critique and community group, while her day job is in theatre. Find her on all social media as @DarthJuno. And now pay attention, for our tale is about to begin, and the moths are fluttering inside.
Moths and a Fluttering Heart by Christine Lucas. Narrated by Kat Kerbetti. When Maria returned to her village, she found it burned to the ground. Nothing was left of her kinspeople but blackened corpses littered across the village square. She searched around, with the moths in her gut a panicked swarm, stinging to be let out. Everyone else had been shot on the narrow cobblestone streets. On weak knees, with eyes burning from the lingering smoke, she turned towards the woods, her moths breathless with guilt and relief in equal parts. If Evdokia, the midwife, hadn't sent her to the herbalist 2 towns over, she'd be dead too. At the edge of the village, Maria stumbled on PodCastle, shot by the Virgin's shrine, in a pool of blood. Maria sniffed, and he raised his head, his eyes unfocused. "Maria, is that you, girl?" Barely a whisper. Maria gawked, then nodded. He'd called her just Maria, not Zavo Maria. The slur that the villagers had attached to her name had stuck enough that its omission made Maria uncomfortable, as though it made her less and more at the same time. "Nazis," PodCastle managed. "Looking for resistance fighters. We didn't tell." A fit of cough. "Evdokia, dead too. See to Karen's supper, girl. Don't leave us here stranded." He raised his right hand, the tips of his first 3 fingers brought together, and air-crossed her, before his arm fell limp. "May God's old and new bless you, child. Forgive me." And he spoke no more. The ferryman's supper. Maria's moths fluttered all at once. She picked up her skirts and ran into the woods. Dawn hadn't broken yet. Would she make it on time? She ran up the nearby hill and then downwards into the small ravine, to the banks of the creek. Not far from there, the ravine opened up to a deep canyon, its slopes a forest of pines and ancient oaks, the sisters of the Dodona Grove. The creek swelled and joined with more creeks to become a Heron, before the dark depths of the world siphoned its waters beneath the surface. Maria headed away from the Acheron, towards the little hut and the nearby cavern, where the villagers brought their herds every November to outwait the winter's cold. It was safe inside the hut. Few people could find it, most of them dead now. Dishes were stacked on a narrow table by the cold hearth, and sacks of grain and buckets for milking the goats at the other side. Maria sat on an old, creaking stool to catch her breath. Her panicked moths had fled her gut and plodded through her blood now, making her dizzy. She took deep breaths to rid her nostrils from the stench of burned flesh, inhaling the scents of curdled goat milk and pine wood. Then of other unsettling scents, of murky waters and dead tadpoles, and just a whiff of honeysuckle. The ferryman's scent, and the scent of the death that followed his heels. Maria sprang to her feet. The supper! She really was Zavo, sitting idle while Karen waited. If she angered him, would he forsake the souls of her kin? Would he release the dead upon these lands as punishment? She shook her head until the moths with wings of guilt scattered from her thoughts. No, she'd make sure no such thing would happen, now that Evdokia was gone. She filled a bowl with grain and a cup with wine and placed them on a tray. The moment she opened the door to carry the tray to the riverbank, the stench of stagnant waters and rotting leaves made the moths in her heart stand absolutely still. Just before dawn's first light, the shade of flowing robes on a skeletal form boarded the rising fog over the creek. Fog shaped as a boat. But he boarded alone. Alone? Without the souls of her people? Would they return to haunt her for failing them? What has she done wrong? The coins! She'd forgotten about the coins! Maria put the tray down, then marched to the box hidden behind the hut and filled with an assortment of coins. Turkish piastres, 10 lepta Greek coins, even a few ancient drachmas and obols. She pocketed a handful of them, picked up the pickaxe and headed home, praying at every step that the Nazis wouldn't return. Along the trail, her own mind betrayed her with words of scorn, and her thoughts had the voices of the dead. "Where are you going, Zavo? Zavo Maria? Stay with the goats where you belong. You'll only make things worse." Had the haunting started already? Evdokia had always insisted they had 3 dawns for Karen to accept the fare. Maria hadn't been away that long. She tried to count on her fingers and failed. She wiped her eyes. Zavo Maria. Crooked Maria, for the small hunch of her backbone and her lazy left eye. Stupid Maria, for her stutter when her gut swelled with panicked moths that choked her and tied her tongue. The villagers called her other things, too. Wind-blown and light of shadow, for seeing and hearing things that weren't there. She almost turned around, but then the moths fluttered back into her chest and sheltered her heart with their warmth. So she soldiered on. She buried Papakostas at the side of his martyrdom, near the Virgin's shrine, with a copper drachma in his mouth. Then on to the village square, to the others. When she approached the pile, she found a dog guarding the corpses. The animal wagged her tail when she saw Maria. Arcus, a silly herd dog, who thought all chickens were her pups. She'd lost half her left ear defending goats from wolves one winter, and that also earned her a limp and a useless left eye. It almost earned her a bullet to the head, too. The villagers wouldn't keep around animals that couldn't earn their keep. But Maria had cried and begged, and Arcus was left roaming the village, begging for scraps and abducting chickens. And now she stood guard by her murdered masters. Maria whistled, and Arcus ran to her. "We can't leave them like that," Maria told her, her voice low, her words perfectly articulated, like every time she spoke to animals. "We must get them ready. Be good now. If you scare the ferryman away, what will happen to them?" The dog watched Maria, tail wagging and tongue hanging, as Maria started to dig. "But if you're a good girl," Maria said, "Karen might let you meet his own dog, who's a king among dogs. He has 3 heads, too." The soil hadn't hardened yet from winter's first frost, but was still hard for Maria. As the sun rose, her back and shoulders ached, her palms blistered, and sweat soaked her undergarments. But she couldn't stop. She had to finish by nightfall, so Karen would take them along this time. She kept the fluttering moths in her gut drowsy with all the stories Evdokia had told her over the years. She'd never said them aloud before, because of her stutter. Arcus wagged her tail, and sometimes dug too. "Cerberus, I think he's called. Yes, really, 3 heads, and he herds the souls of the dead." Maria propped herself on the pickaxe, catching her breath. "What do you think, girl? Would he make a good husband to you?" Maria giggled and started digging again. "Evdokia promised me a husband before the war." There's this lad, this Janos, 2 villages over, who's big and strong. I saw him last year at the mid-August gathering. He's good-looking, too. I didn't talk to him. What could I say? Evdokia said he's Zavos like me. He can't read, but he works hard and doesn't hit women. Evdokia promised that he doesn't. Perhaps just a slap or two when he's tired. He promised her this when she told him about me. After all this, Evdokia promised she'd arrange for... After all this, after the war. But there was no after anymore, none that mattered, except perhaps Karen's ministry. She glanced at Arcos's wide eyes. You know, perhaps you will meet Cerberus. There's always that one woman in every generation to tend to Karen, so the old ways won't be forgotten, and the area receives his blessing and remains free of the restless dead. That was Evdokia. But now she's dead. They know, those wise women, and return to service life after life on Karen's boat. But now there's no one left. Only Zavo Maria. Only Zavo Maria. Her voice broke. Her eyes welled up at the sight of the scorched pile that was her past and her present, at the long stretch of empty days that was her after. A long line of dawns, carrying the tray to the riverside, awaiting the true wise woman. She rubbed her chest to quiet her anguished moths that wanted out of her ribcage, out, to join the others, so she wouldn't be an outcast, even in death. She'd lost her parents very young to smallpox, and ever since, these people had been her family. Sure, they called her Zavo, and they sometimes made jokes and played pranks she didn't understand that made her weep. And sometimes they shoved her a little too hard, and the youngsters stole her things. But didn't all families squabble? Evdokia had taught her secrets and lore, and Papa Costas had let her sleep in the church during the cold winter nights, and the baker had always given her all of yesterday's bread, and she'd always been given clothes and shoes without many holes. And now she was all alone. Careful jaws around her hand, pulling her away. Maria blinked. Arcos was right. She couldn't linger. She had to do right by Evdokia. If she took too long, the ferryman would again leave them behind for good. Just before dusk, she started throwing the remains in. She had no time to piece them together. In they went, charred thighs and blackened backbones, skulls brittle from the fire that crumbled in her hands, bones big and small, some with the christening crosses melted into the ribs, along with wedding bands, Nazar charms, and gold teeth. Arcos helped too, carrying body parts, then digging frantically to cover them up. Maria fingered the coins in her skirt's pocket. Sometimes nothing could save the dead, like that Nazi collaborator, that Mastro Petrunia from Vilofo. He became Katahanas, destined to haunt the crossroads until the world's breaking. If she tossed the coins into the ground, what if the ferryman missed them amidst the pebbles and the dirt? She'd try another way. She covered the burial mound and returned to the hut. Arcos followed her steps. Maria chose the shiniest tin bowl to hold the coins. She left the bowl at the edge of the water, on the limestone slab next to the ferryman's supper, so he'd know that he had passengers to pick up. Maria stood and watched the water, biting her nails. She watched until the sickle moon descended over the treetops and the owls hooted their warnings. Maria hurried back and curled up amidst the goats in the cavern. Arcos came and nuzzled her way into her arms. When she woke up the next morning, both food and coins were gone. The seasons changed, and the forest swelled to claim the ruins of her village. Dandelions sprouted from cracks in broken walls. White patches of chamomile littered the border between ash and soil, and sparrows perched atop the bell tower. Trees bloomed and bore fruit, apples, figs, and mirabelles. Some of the hens who had scattered into the woods returned and cooped up in the remnants of the old bakery. Maria gathered fruit and eggs, and Karen's supper dish was never wanting. A replacement for Karen's ministry never came. The fighter planes stopped flying overhead. Bands of troops sometimes passed through the woods. Maria hid when she heard them approach. She knew what enemy troops, sometimes friendly too, did to lone women. Evdokia had explained things to her. So Maria hid and counted the passing of years by the blooming of the almond tree just outside the ruins. 5 times the tree bloomed, 5 springs since she buried her kinspeople. She considered visiting the other villages, but she couldn't risk missing Karen's supper. What if she came across more Nazis? So she made her home in the goat cavern. Her cot of straw and hole-ridden blankets itched a little, but it was warm, if a little hectic, with all the bleating and the indignant clucking of the chickens Arcus carried to the cave. She shoved her dreams of family and home, of a husband and children, to the back of her mind, beneath a carpet of moths with numbing wings. This was now her purpose and her duty, to keep the supper bowl full and the land safe. It was life, such as it was. Shortly after the almond tree bloomed for the 6th time, Maria found the wounded soldier sprawled atop the burial mound in the village. At first, she thought him one of the undead who prowled the northern forests. Too many of those killed on the Albanian front had been left on unhallowed ground. But this one sobbed like the living. Maria hid behind a blackened wall, now covered in ivy. What was he? Threat or kin? He sported a blood-soaked bushy beard. He wore a tattered army uniform, and a pistol was strapped at his belt. His left arm hung as if damaged, and with his right palm, he stroked the soil. "Mana," he cried. "Mana." Maria's throat choked on a sob, on a torrent of moths aflame by the sudden swell of grief. He'd come home to his mother and found a grave. Whose son? She'd never dared to look at young men long, so they wouldn't think her shameless. With all that hair, would she recognize him, even if she knew him? But those brows, that nose. He resembled Evdokia's son, who'd left to fight as soon as the war had started. There had been no news, no letters, and everyone had assumed him dead. What was his name? Elias? Maria sat and waited. The sun rose overhead until he lay still and quiet, and the moths in her heart fluttered all at once. The poor man wasn't a threat. He was kin. Injured kin. How could she have left him baking under the sun without a sip of water? So she forced herself up and approached him with slow, cautious steps. A cry when he saw her. Was it her loose hair? Was it the twigs and dead leaves and straw caught in her wild curls? Was it her lazy eye? Her trembling lips that had forgotten how to form words? Or was it her clothes that hung loose and flowed behind her like hole-ridden rags of a Vurkolakas, freshly risen from her grave? A cry, a gasp. Then his eyes rolled backwards, and his head fell on the mound. The moths circled Maria's heart in a fluttering clinch. Had she scared him so much that his mind broke? She leaned closer, and her moths quivered in unison when his chest heaved. Blood soiled his uniform, a dark stain between heart and shoulder. He needed help, whoever he was. Evdokia had taught her to treat injuries, willow bark for his fever, honey for his wound, and a mix of herbs and thick soup to stop the bleeding. But how to carry him back? She'd seen the villagers put together a stretcher from poplar branches once, to carry a woodsman with a broken bone down from the mountain. If she tore her underskirt to make rope, could she do the same? She couldn't. The underskirt turned rope couldn't support his weight. The stretcher came apart after 20 paces, near the old bakery. Maria managed to drag him by his good arm there. Arcus spat out a young chicken and watched with her good eye, her body rigid. Maria rolled the man over into a sheltered corner, between broken walls and poplar trees, hoping she hadn't injured him further. Arcus took a sniff. Her ears twitched back at the scent of blood, and then she turned to Maria. "Stay. Defend." Maria hoped that Arcus's herd-guarding instincts would kick in. When Maria returned with blankets, clean cloth, wild honey, and a cup of willow bark brew, Arcus hadn't moved. "Good girl," Maria told the dog, who then ran after the nearest chicken to mother it. It took Maria a while to wrestle the man's tunic off. There was an exit wound at his back, so she didn't have to dig into his chest to get the bullet out. After she'd cleaned his wound, she managed to feed him a little bit of brew. He shifted in and out of consciousness, calling her Mana at times, pushing her hands away, sometimes cursing, "Those damn traitors," then sputtering about security battalions. Eventually, his eyes regained focus. He met her gaze, then finished the brew in one breathless gulp. "Thank you," he whispered. "You? Savo Maria?" She nodded, her tongue a knot of quivering moths. "The Nazis?" Another nod. Salty moisture stung her nose. "Mana?" She shook her head. He covered his eyes with his palm. "She loved you, you know." A deep sigh. Then he lay his head back down and wept himself to sleep. Maria sat cross-legged beside him. Arcus came and curled up beside her, her massive head a welcome weight on Maria's thigh. But the dog kept sniffing the air and turning towards the soiled tunic. The moths in Maria's heart fluttered with concern. Wolves and lynxes prowled these woods, and he was easy prey. She'd better go down to the creek and wash the blood off. Elias had blankets for the night, and Arcus would help keep him warm. On the way back, her heart swelled with exhilarated moths. After the village burned, the forest had been a home, and Arcus her family. What could Elias become for her? A mate? A memory? Or another corpse to bury, and a soul for Karen? Maria stopped by the hut to pick up a coin. Just in case, she'd sew it into the tunic's hem. She filled the dishes, but found she couldn't carry everything at once. So she left the supper and picked up the tunic, the washing bat, and her last bar of soap, and headed to the shallows of the creek. She'd barely soaked the stained tunic into the water when the others found her. 3 armed men, 3 gendarmes, and the forest fell silent in their passing. One of them had officer's stripes on his shoulders. The other 2 followed his heel. He glanced at her for a moment that stretched on, as if measuring her from loose hair to bare feet. His gaze fell on the stained tunic in her hands, and it chilled her more than the water's flow. "Whose is that, wench?" Her voice stuck in her throat in a web of frantic moths, warning her to still her tongue. Only a garbled sound came out. She sprang to her feet to flee. The second gendarme grabbed her by the arm and held the tunic up to the light. She tried not to stare, but her moths found his cheekbones and the crook of his nose familiar. "That's the commie scum's, no doubt," he said. "That's where I shot him, and it's the village idiot who found it. Just our luck." The officer lit a cigarette. "You know this wench, Stavros?" Stavros nodded. "Just a burnt-brained idiot the midwife and the priest looked after. I guess old Evdokia felt guilty for botching her delivery. Instead of telling her parents the child was stillborn and leaving her in the forest for the wolves, the midwife kept her around as a pet and filled her empty head with nonsense about old gods. And here we are." He spat on the ground and tossed the tunic aside. "We won't get anything out of her. Her tongue is as useless as her brain." The officer took a long inhale. "She knows how to wash off blood, doesn't she? If she can wash, she can point." He gestured at the third gendarme, the one with a wide face and the bulk of a bear. "Yano, bring her. You said there's a goat herd's hut around here?" "Janos? Her Janos? No, it couldn't be him." Maria dared a glimpse at the large man's face. It sure looked like him. Same build, same restless gaze, 2 brown eyes checking for lurking enemies in everything that moved. Maria had seen how the others treated him in that one festival after a drunken fight broke loose. They goaded him to the front to take the bulk of the hits and deliver a few back. They fed him scraps of acceptance and cheers that were mockery and disgust in equal parts, to lull his heart that yearned for family and kin, for purpose. None of the villagers had been family and kin. Not really. They hadn't wanted them. What use was a zavot to them? Maria knew that. Every last moth in her heart knew that. She'd never belong, no matter how Evdokia had struggled to prove otherwise, stranded between love and guilt herself. And now the man Evdokia had promised her as a husband, the one who'd claimed to never hit women, dragged her into the hut by her hair. Did Janos know that the other gendarme was using him? Did he care? Maria tried to protest, tried to tell him, "It's me, you're Maria, the one who'd be your bride once the war was over, the one you said you wouldn't hit." But she choked on her sobs. Panicked moths lined her throat, grappling on every sound and tearing it apart. All that reached her tongue were shreds of words begging him, "No!" Once inside the hut, without as much as a grunt, Janos threw her down. The impact pushed the air out of her lungs, along with a single sound. His name, a plea and a prayer. "Jano, you promised." The others chuckled. They laughed, slap after slap, kick after kick, until her head buzzed like a wasp's nest, and her moths lay absolutely still, a carpet of motionless wings in the pit of her stomach. "Give up the communist scum, wench," Stavros said, somewhere above her. She couldn't see him. Her right eye wouldn't open, and her left saw only the dirt floor of the hut. "He's not worth it. Take us to him, and we leave you be." A lie. Maria knew it. Let them call her bird-brained and light of shadow and wind-blown. She knew it. They'd kill her. And they'd kill Elias and Arcos and slaughter the chickens for their supper. And she knew that she would eventually lead them there. If the moths hadn't stolen her voice, she would have told them already to end the pain. But right now, Maria had no voice to speak, no strength to get up and point, only to lay down and watch ants and bugs crawl on the dirt and count her final moments in blood dripping from her nostrils. The gendarmes left her on the floor while they rummaged through the hut and pocketed Evdokia's coins. After they finished the wine she'd stored for Karen, they continued with the raki from their backpacks. They drank and laughed and smoked, and the officer said that he knew some Americans who would pay good money for ancient artifacts, like the coins. Drunken plans followed about all the things they'd do to that injured communist and all his comrades once they caught him, until all three passed out in deep slumber. Something glinted in the starlight that crept through the boards of the roof, an arm's reach away from her. The coin she'd pocketed before they came. It had slipped from her pocket during the beating. But what did it matter now? Did anything of all that matter? Anything Evdokia had told her, when it scattered so easily in the hands of those who were smarter, stronger, better? The officer snored on the narrow divan, with his feet on the old cedar stool. They hadn't broken the stool for firewood, but they had broken her. She was less to them than a stool. But the stool wasn't crooked. It wasn't zavon. Worthless. Nothing. It took a beating and a black eye to finally see the truth through the mist of her lazy eye. She had always been nothing. A fluttering caress over her swollen eye. A moth. Not one of her own, that were now slowly awakening in her gut. A wild moth. One of those the locals called little souls, for they embodied the souls of the dead. Its wings touched her aching eyelid again, sprinkling nymph dust and restoring the sight. And Maria saw beyond the confines of her body and the hut. She caught a glimpse of Elias sitting up beside Arcus. Another flutter of the wild moth's wings, and it spoke with an ancient, feminine voice. Family comes in many forms. So does purpose. Whose soul are you? Maria wanted to ask. But then Elias glanced around, rubbing the dog's head. Another moth fluttered over his face, and his brow creased. Then he stood up, moaning. He used one of the discarded poplar branches as a crutch and limped away, calling Arcus to follow. Arcus glanced once at the roosting chickens, then towards the ravine. For a moment, the dog's good eye locked in Maria's through the vision, as if seeking permission. Maria could only weep, and she made her tears a blessing. Go, and be safe. Be happy. Then the vision shattered with a sprinkle of moth dust, but not before Maria saw Arcus leaving, following her new master. Only the coin now remained in Maria's vision, and, at the back, by the wall, spilled goat milk and stomped-on grain. Karen's forgotten supper. Maria reached out and grasped the coin, moving her hand as noiselessly as possible. One of the oldest ones, an obol, crafted from ancient metalsmiths long before the gendarme, long before the Nazis and the Ottomans. How much would the officers' Americans pay for this? Did they even know its real value? She clenched her jaw, pushed herself up, and managed to sit. With the coin in her palm, her index finger traced the outline of her swollen eye and her split lower lip. Something cramped inside her and stole her breath. She turned towards the small window, dizzy with air hunger. Through the yellowed curtains, over the narrow bed where the officer snored, A rose hue colored the sky. Somewhere outside, a dog howled. Arcus saying goodbye? No. That howl reverberated through the forest, as if splintering to 3 different howls, from 3 different throats. In her palm, the obol burned. All around her, forms of moth dust and starlight formed, some feminine, some masculine, some neither, some both. None of them were familiar, but all of them were kin. Those who'd come before her, the women who ministered an ancient deity with a 3-headed dog, since before the Trinity, since before the 12. And they all smiled at Maria, welcoming her into their midst. They lingered for a single heartbeat before they dissolved to ash and dust. From beneath the hut's door, a mix of scents slithered inside. Moss and stagnant waters, rotting leaves and dead fish floating on a murky surface. Karen's scent. The moths in her heart fluttered and rose. Her hand moved upwards to place the obol in her mouth and meet the ferryman at last. Not on the ground, on her feet. She rose, and everything hurt. Somewhere at the sidelines of her consciousness, the officer awoke, cursed, and reached for his pistol.
"What you think you're doing, Zavo?"
Maria turned and faced him. "I am not Zavo," she wanted to yell. "I am not nothing. I'm many things, and none of them like you." But when she opened her mouth to speak, the obol grew hot and heavy on her tongue until it dissolved in her mouth, its metal lining the inside of her cheeks and spreading down her throat and up her nose. The sudden taste of ancient metal rallied her moths. Countless little wings, countless little souls flowed out from her throat, from her nostrils and her eyes in an endless torrent. They swirled around her, higher and higher in a maelstrom of wings, then plummeted down around her and lifted her up over the ground. The blood crusting on her face, in her eyes and nostrils, dyed their wings red, and the metal of the obol gave their wings armor. All around her, instead of the flutter of wings, Maria heard the whetting of blades. When the officer pulled the trigger at her, they swarmed and formed a sphere that engulfed the bullet. It took them a moment before scattering in spirals and waves, but no bullet fell to the floor. The officer cursed and aimed again. This time he never shot. The moths charged and shrouded him, a swarm of razors and blades and needles, slicing and pricking and drilling holes through his mouth, his ears, his eyes, through every exposed part of his body they could cut through. When the others awoke at the thud of the body hitting the ground, the swarm of metal wings charged them too. 3 bodies sprawled on the ground, a creek of blood spilling through the crack beneath the door, rushing to meet the Acheron downhill. A cloud of moths hovering over the dead, slowly circling, drunken and dazed at the aftermath of carnage. 3 howls just outside, and the scent of murky waters waxed stronger than the stench of slaughter, rousing her moths. They dusted blood and gore off their wings until they shone in the waning starlight, silver and gold. Then they circled and frothed around her, forming her veil and her wedding gown. Behind the door, her future and forever groom awaited.
And welcome back. That was Moths in a Fluttering Heart by Christine Lucas. And if you enjoyed that, then there's a couple of episodes over at Pseudopod. 697, 5 Fridays During Lent, and 584, The Drowned Man's Kiss, as well as a flash story, Death, from our Littlest Sisters Archives Cast of Wonders episode 257. There's more links at werecat99.wordpress.com under short fiction, too. Christine sent us these notes on today's story. This story was written during the pandemic for a local online writing course, Tales of the Weird, for their Magic Realism and Fabulism section. Out of 6 stories written for that subgenre, 3 had characters named Evdokia, which became an inside joke later on. As for my inspiration, it is an amalgam of old traditions from my father's ancestral village at the north of Greece. I'd also wanted to write a neurodivergent character for a long time, to reflect some of my own struggles as a misdiagnosed neurodivergent adult who grew up during the times when conditions like ADHD were never talked about in good families. Thank you, Christine, for the notes and the story. In the time since I've been diagnosed, at long last, I have, as I suspect is typical, become a bit hyperfixated on knowing all there is to know about autism and ADHD and on hearing other people's experiences of both. Partly that's just neurodivergent hyperfixation, finding a new topic you can deep dive on. But partly it is, I'm certain, finally finding the pages from the scattered manual of life that actually make sense to me. The stories that finally make me realise I do have a place in the world, and other people are already waiting there. One of the best books I've read, and it is perhaps one of the most widely known, but it's for good reason. Neurotribes by the late Steve Silverman, which goes through the full history of autism as we know it now and could recognise it historically in figures like Henry Cavendish. It's fascinating in many ways, particularly seeing the evolving understanding and definition of autism from early categorisations as childhood schizophrenia through the very narrow stereotype of the 70s and 80s to the modern idea of the spectrum. And, as an autistic person and parent to autistic children, it's not only fascinating, but absolutely fucking heartbreaking. For probably the first 40 years of autism, as taken from the days of Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, a childhood diagnosis was effectively life-ending. Parents were told, in the moments after diagnosis, to grieve their child, because they were effectively dead to them. This child would never grow to be a useful and productive member of society and would, at maybe 5 years old, be put into a mental institute and remain there forever. And it would be easier all round on everyone if they simply pretended their son was dead so they could all move on with their lives, so the vulnerable kid at the heart of all this wasn't confused by the false hope of seeing the people who were meant to care for him, and he could instead be left to slip between the cracks of a system that had already dismissed his life's worth at an age most of us only just start school. My use of masculine pronouns there was deliberate, by the way, given the diagnostic criteria at the time. Autism in non-masculine folk is still under-researched and under-diagnosed, though at least the definition allows it now. What the fuck? At 5 years old, these kids were discarded and abandoned by a system and society that didn't see the point in bothering to keep them around. I don't blame the parents here, to be clear. How were they to know better if this was the state-of-the-art understanding of the medical profession advising them? If they'd known, truly, what autism is, who their child was, I have no doubt that not a one of them would have actively made the choice to leave their child to treatment that was, effectively, torture. And do not get me started on applied behavioural theories. I refuse to call it therapy, it is just torture through electrocution to force masking to make a person less of an inconvenience to others around them, prioritising the comforts of adults over the physical and emotional well-being of a fucking child. Okay, saying that, maybe some still would have gone through with it back in the day. But gods below, I do not think I've ever heard a horror story as awful as the idea you might be judged at 5 years old whether you'll ever be useful to society, and if not, left to rot forever, your whole life wasted. There's an urge now for me to start explaining that neurodivergent kids, in my experience as a former child and as a parent now, simply develop at a different rate, that while we may start slower out the blocks with delayed speech development and struggles with fine and gross motor skills, that by the time we hit 20 or 25 we've often not only caught up but surpassed our neurotypical peers, that we not only can contribute to society but are perhaps more likely to contribute the sort of transformational ideas that push society forward in leaps, as Henry Cavendish did with his formal and structured approach to science and chemistry. But honestly, that's just seeding the argument, not to mention abandoning those of us with higher needs. It's playing into the idea that society is a fucking transaction, that people only have worth if they contribute back, that our lives are columns in a narrowly focused ledge of economic productivity. And if we're not going to end up in the black, then cut your losses now. Why bother? Why waste time and resources? What a hollow, pitiable view of existence. Let's take 14 billion years of creation and all its possibilities now and to come. The 100 trillion neural connections in each and every one of our brains and all the thoughts and emotions that will course through them in a lifetime. And to reduce all that down to one person's contribution to fucking GDP, a made-up number applied to an artificially divided chunk of land within made-up borders that only truly affects the 0.1%. What moral and emotional poverty that is. The whole village was ready to discard Maria in today's story. Perhaps the whole village believed what Stavros said out loud, that it would have been better for the midwife to lie to her parents and pretend she was stillborn, to leave her for the wolves to eat. And I'm not going to say, ha, look, they were wrong. If it hadn't been for Maria, who would have ensured Charon took their souls down the sticks? No. Her utility and service do not exist to be a counter-argument to their prejudice. Maria herself exists to do that. Maria is her own justification. There's no purpose or reason needed beyond that. I happened to listen to an episode from my horrifying sister Pseudopod earlier today, episode 976, Every Gossamer Strand. In the outro, Kat quotes Brené Brown, something I'd not heard before, but my goodness, does it ever, in one single sentence, capture 38 years of pre-diagnosis mistakes and fuck-ups and desperation from me. No amount of external validation can heal the wound from not being seen for who you truly are. But there's another quote from Brené Brown that I think is more fitting here, both for today's story and for our Disability Pride and Magic Month as a whole. Don't walk through the world looking for evidence that you don't belong, because you will always find it. Don't walk through the world looking for evidence that you're not enough, because you will always find it. Our worth and our belonging are not negotiated with other people. We carry those inside of our hearts. That was our show for this week. On behalf of everyone at PodCastle, your co-editors were Nini Kamamia and Devon Martin, assistant editor Caitlin Zavanovich, audio engineer Eric Valdes, and our many wonderful first readers, Andrew Cahoe, Baloan Conte, Craig Jackson, Amalia Harrington, Julia Patt, Kieran Corsini, Tanya Barry, Tava Nova, Tierney Bailey, Zeev Witties, and myself, Matt Dovey. Thank you for letting us share another story with you. The legal bit. PodCastle is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. That means you can share it, and please do, but you cannot sell it and you cannot change it. If you want specifics, check creativecommons.org. Our music is by Shiva in Exile. Everything we do on PodCastle is 100% donor funded, and if you'd like to support what we and the rest of EA do, please join us on our Patreon at patreon.com/EAPodcasts. Prefer another method? There's details for supporting us via Twitch, Amazon Prime, Ko-fi and PayPal on escapeartist.net, and you can email us to ask questions at donations@escapeartist.net. We'll be back next Tuesday with another fantastic tale. In the meantime, you might care to check out our sister podcasts: Escape Pod for science fiction, Pseudopod for horror, Cast of Wonders for YA speculative fiction, and Catscast for speculative cat stories. If your heart belongs to us though, we'll see you next week. Be safe and be kind.